Emma Nabiloff. Emma is the director for the Intergroup Relation Program here at UCLA. She earned a BA in Racial Injustice and Society in School and an MA in American Studies at the George Washington University. She's the former director of the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network in Washington, D.C. And here at UCLA, Emma works closely with students, staff, and faculty doing trainings, workshops, dialogue events, etc. So thank you very much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm not using the PowerPoint, so those of you that are back here, if you wouldn't mind filling in over here so we can, I know, so we can all be friends. Thank you. I know you just got cozy, just got your life set up. May or may not know how to turn it off, but nothing else is going up there. So as we're filling in the spots here, couple notes. I have a short agenda, and then most of what we're going to be doing is going to be driven by what questions you have, what things have come up in your classrooms, what sort of hypothetical questions are going on for you, and especially what real-life questions. So for some things, I'll ask you to turn to a partner. For other things, we'll talk about it in the whole group. I think we have decided that the first part where mostly I'm talking is going to be video recorded, and then we're going to turn it off. So that the scenarios that you bring, the situations that have come up for you, those will stay confidential in this room and will not be video recorded. Sound cool? Amazing. Thank you so much. Handout packets are being passed around. No need to get into them yet, although nothing's a secret. You're welcome to. These are for you. Some of the handouts we will get to, some of them we won't, depending on where your interests are. But all of them are there for you as a resource forever. Frame it, do whatever you want. We are actually the Intergroup Dialogue program. Intergroup Dialogue is a formal dialogue system housed at the University of Michigan. Have any of you interacted with Intergroup Dialogue in the past? Okay, one happy nod. It's the best. Two happy nods. Okay. I'll give you the extremely short version just because I think it sort of helps to place it where it is. The Intergroup Relations program is housed in the Bruin Resource Center, which is part of Student Affairs here at UCLA. The Bruin Resource Center is primarily a center that works with historically underrepresented populations. We work with transfer students. We work with undocumented students. We work with students who are current or former foster youth. We work with students who have children or other dependents that they take care of, students who are in recovery, lots of different types of folks, also veteran students. And so we have all these programs, and then intergroup relations is sort of the glue that teaches them how to really talk to each other. Although IGR also predates most of those programs here at UCLA. So if any of you are having issues with, I don't know how to make my class more responsive to students who have PTSD, to students who have children and so are on campus at sort of unpredictable times of day, connecting with the Bruin Resource Center is a great way to get those questions answered. The Intergroup Dialogue program was brought to UCLA around 2008, 2009, but it's a lot older than that. I think what's helpful is that dialogue itself is a word that a lot of people use in sort of a general sense. Oh, we as a country need to have a dialogue about gun rights. We're having a fight, let's have a dialogue about it. But when I use it in a very specific, bounded, formal sense. And that sense comes from sort of 1.5 different trajectories. The first is that in the 1970s and 80s, there was a guy who was pretty high up in the State Department in charge of the Middle East. His name was Hal Saunders, and he was extremely important. He helped negotiate the Camp David Peace Accords, which for those of you who study politics are a quite big deal in the world of accords. He helped end the Iran hostage crisis. He was really involved in some of the biggest, messiest, most complex, deadly conflicts of the time. And he noticed that groups that were transforming these conflicts, moving from war to peace accords, were going through the same stages and doing the same things. And that it was a slow, pretty predictable process, which he named sustained dialogue. And he wrote a lot of books about it, which you're welcome to read. They're not light reading, shall we say. So he wrote a lot of things about it. Those things then went in two different directions. One direction was that in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a set of student protests at the University of Michigan, primarily about the treatment of Black and African American students. No surprise to us today, these students were not being treated the way that their white peers were, and not being treated the way that they wanted to be. They created a list of demands, very similar to today, and those demands turned into the formation of an intergroup dialogue program at the University of Michigan that was based on these sustained dialogue materials from international conflict resolution. And then that center grew at Michigan and has spread to other schools, and we are now a part of that network here at UCLA. Congratulations. The other branch that it took was that sustained dialogue kept going itself. It became its own nonprofit organization, and in 1999 it created its own campus network for bringing the lessons of international conflict resolution to help resolve primarily race-related issues on campuses, and that branch started at Princeton. And I tell you that because that's how I'm formally trained. So when I was an undergraduate student, I was trained in the intergroup dialogue methodology. I focused primarily on interfaith dialogue when I was an undergrad. After I graduated college, I went to Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts. After I graduated college, I joined a group here in LA called the New Ground Project, which is a group of Muslims and Jewish young professionals who come together for 6 to 8 months and meet in dialogue and really transform our relationships with each other. I was a participant in that. That was also an intergroup dialogue experience. From there, I ended up moving to Israel for a minute, doing some coexistence work there, some interfaith work. And then when I came back to the U.S., I started working for Sustained Dialogue, for their nonprofit, helping implement dialogue on college campuses across the U.S. I worked there for about 5.5 years before I came here. So as we're going through this training, I'm going to have examples from a whole bunch of different schools. I worked with at least 10 different schools a year, each year that I was there. I'd fly in, do trainings like this, train students, train staff, train faculty, and then basically consult with them on an annual basis. So that's sort of how I come to this role. I've been here at UCLA for about a year, so as we're going through this, you know UCLA better than I do likely, you know your classrooms better than I do likely, but I've been a lot of places and I've worked with a lot of faculty having a lot of issues with different students, and so that's when I say, like, I worked at a school where blah blah, you might be like, how have you worked at this many schools? And it's because I was basically a consultant. So that's all the history that doesn't really matter, but I think is some helpful framing about the stuff in your handout packet is a mixture of formal intergroup relations stuff and formal sustained dialogue stuff. So that explains a little bit of that. Okay, you ready to do the things?
Yes.
Thank you. Does everybody have a handout packet? Can you raise your hand if you have no handout packet? Fantastic. Okay. Please join me on page 3 of your handout packet. It says, what is dialogue at the top? So in the world of dialogue, it's useful to talk about capital D dialogue and lowercase d dialogue. This definition is for capital D dialogue, but most of what we're going to be talking about in this workshop is lowercase d dialogue, which is basically how to use the lessons and tools of this in your normal life. So I'm not asking you to get another job, your 17th job, where you're also like leading a formal dialogue process, because let me tell you, that's a hard job. What I am asking you to do is think about how to take some of the lessons from this into the work that you're already doing, ideally with the goal of making the work that you're already doing easier to do and more successful. So, with that said, here's a definition of dialogue that I find really helpful. It says, dialogue is a process of genuine interaction through which human beings listen to each other deeply enough to be changed by what they learn. Each makes a serious effort to take the other's concerns into their own picture, even when disagreement persists. No participant gives up their own identity, but each recognizes enough of the other's valid human claims so that they will act differently toward the other. That's the definition from Hal Saunders. We don't introduce dialogue to say that it is better than any other form of communication. I genuinely don't believe that dialogue is better than other things. I don't believe it is better than academic discussion. I don't believe it is better than debate. But I believe that it is distinct from those things. I think what is helpful is to think about dialogue as a different dialect. And what I will ask you to do, to challenge yourself to do, is to become as fluent in that dialect as you are in all the other dialects that you have. So basically, to intentionally code switch into and out of dialogue when you need to. And that when you need to is really what we're going to be talking about here. When are the moments to go in and when are the moments to go out? What I'm not going to ask you to do is dialogue all the time. Just take everything you've ever been doing, throw it out, and replace it with this. That is a recipe for disaster. Your life would be horrible if you did that. Very slow, very painstaking. I'm not asking you to do that. But in particularly hot moments in the classroom, particularly in moments where you sort of freeze and you don't know what to do, I need you to be fluent in dialogue so that that can come out if you need it to, rather than sort of an instinctive reaction coming out that may or may not be what you wanted it to be. Does that make sense? Okay, super. So, using dialogue rather than other things is particularly useful, I think, for faculty, for folks who are TAing in the classroom in a number of different situations. Number one is navigating tough topics. You're talking about something that you just know is going to be tough. Maybe you're doing readings that involve sexual assault or that involve lynching or that involve sort of graphic depictions of racism. It's useful for de-escalating conflict, especially in a seminar discussion or a small classroom, in a lab. Students are going to have conflict. Things are going to be escalating. And then how do you de-escalate that and get it sort of back down to a simmer? Typically through dialogue. It's incredibly useful in office hours or one-on-one with students. Both when students come in and they're angry at you, but also when students come in and they're in distress about stuff that's not about you. They come in to talk about the paper and then all of a sudden they're crying and you're like, wah! Dialogue is a good thing to do in that moment. And something we can talk about if you have questions about. One of the handouts here is about active listening, which is useful especially in one-on-one situations, especially for, can you raise your hand if you're a real solution-oriented person? Someone comes to you with a problem and you're like, here are 6 solutions, have you tried them? Raise your hand if that's you. Don't be shy. Okay, about half the room, let the camera know. About half the room, but a lot of little scared arms. Dialogue and forms of active listening are helpful ways to sit on that impulse until it's the right time to offer solutions. The reason for that is simply that offering solutions is the end of a conversation, and if you offer them, you may not actually get to why they were there. An example that I'll give is pretty much every school, their counseling center is understaffed. Especially now that we are doing a lot of work to break down the stigma of going to get help for mental health. It's going really well. The stigma's going away, but there's not more funding for the counseling center, and so they are there's a deluge here and everywhere. I was at a school a while ago, a very, very small school, having the same problem. I was in a circle with faculty and with students. They were talking about mental health, and the students were saying how hard it is to get an appointment for mental health at that school. 3 to 4 week wait, even when you're in distress. It's really tough. And the faculty were sort of dumbstruck. They didn't know that there was such a long wait. And so they were saying, what I've been doing is what I was taught, which was when a student comes to me in distress, I walk them to the counseling center. That's what I was taught to do. That's the responsible thing to do. And they didn't know that the student was not able to get help at the counseling center. So if a student came to you and said, I'm in distress, I'm having a really hard time, I'm depressed, and you said, why haven't you gone to CAPS? Or have you gone to CAPS? Or let me help you make an appointment at CAPS. By trying to solve the problem, you haven't asked them, what have you tried? And they might say, I'm on the waiting list for CAPS, but I can't get in for 3 weeks. So making sure that you're not offering solutions until you really understand what's going on. That's a big part of what dialogue is. It's also useful for keeping your classroom discussions civil. So if you're talking about a hot topic, I don't know if any of you are involved, but the Common Book this year is about to be happening. It's a book about someone who joins Border Patrol to learn more about the border. There are a lot of classroom conversations that could be really productive about this book, but there are a lot that could go really sideways, depending on your facilitation. And so dialogue is a useful skill there. And the last thing I think that's particularly useful, it's the next hour and a half or what I think is particularly useful, but the last thing on my list here is that dialogue helps you ask the question that you mean to be asking in class. So just like with a dialect, making sure that you are asking what you want in order to get what you want. Have any of you ever been teaching where you've asked a question and you're hoping for something from the book, sort of a text-based response, and people start spewing their personal stories? I had this especially in education classes. People were like, in my high school. We were like, that's not actually what we are looking for here. Dialogue is sort of the opposite. What if you were trying to get people to share their personal experiences with something, or to sort of dig deep into what particularly about this is important to you, and they're just giving you the numbers. They're citing statistics. Dialogue is the skill of asking the question to get exactly what you want from them. So, we're going to do several case studies. All of them are going to be from your real life, except for this one. We'll start with this one. This is a case study from my real life. Hold, please. So, I was doing a training for faculty at a school that was not this school, and a faculty member told me, this is the end of the training. It was a 3-hour training. It was very long. At the end of it, a faculty member came up to me and said, I'm uncomfortable that you told me that we should be using the word undocumented in our classroom instead of some of the other words to refer to people. And he said, when a student uses another word in my class, I'm not going to tell them not to do it because I think the word undocumented has liberal bias. So, this is our case study. You're the faculty member, you're in a class, you're talking about immigration, and students are using all types of words but are not consistently using the word undocumented. So there are 3 possible responses to this. A debate response, a discussion response, and a dialogue response. The debate responses to folks who are not using the word undocumented, instead are using other dehumanizing language. Debate response is to something like, you can't say that word, say this word instead. Stop what you're doing and do my thing, no reason given. Debate response can also be, what this person said to me, telling someone to change their language is a violation of the First Amendment, and so I won't do that in my classroom. It's a debate response. That's a conversation ender. A my way or the highway. There are times when you want to my way or the highway in your classroom, absolutely. A discussion response, a more academic type response, could be things like, regarding that word, studies show, or national trends are pointing us to this word being more accepted than the other ones that you're using. An academic response could be, what does the First Amendment say about this? Or what are the limits of free speech on the grounds of a public university? we can talk about the concepts involved there. Dialogue responses are going to sound really different there. A dialogue response can be, tell me about your history with the term you just used. What made you choose that term over any of the others? A dialogue response, and then at a certain point, I, as a faculty member, would not permit anybody using any word other than undocumented in my classroom. The dialogue way to shut that down is to say, in this class, we challenge each other intellectually, but we do not challenge each other's basic humanity. So an intellectual discussion about this topic can only happen when humanity is affirmed. For that reason, we're going to use the humanizing language of undocumented rather than other terms which are by their very nature dehumanizing. If you have questions, you can come see me in office hours. So that's a shutdown for a reason, which is empathy-based, humanity-based. You can come talk to me about it in office hours, but I am prioritizing the humanity and safety of other people in the class, and that's what I'm choosing to do in this classroom. Come talk to me about it if you don't like it. Do you see how each of those things are quite different from each other? And how there is like a sort of dialecty shift there? Everyone's like, oh, I don't know, that's scary. Okay, you're doing amazing. But speaking of what you're doing, my part's over. If we could please turn that sucker off. And now it's time for us to chat. I would like for you to